The finals of Pogchamps 3 is finally here. Today we're doing a recap for that match. It was between Rainn Wilson and Sardoche. Let's jump straight in. In the first game, Rainn Wilson had the white pieces, and he went for e4, c5, knight to f3, and now e6 and b3. The idea is that white is trying to put a bishop on a very long and nice diagonal. And by putting the bishop here, you're already targeting this pawn, which not only helps you have a very nice piece, but also stops temporarily this bishop from developing. Otherwise, you would lose this pawn and actually the rook behind the pawn. And so it's already a very dangerous setup. In black's perspective, you have to play very carefully here. d5 is a good move, striking in the center, and now e5, which is a very questionable move. If you took and then simply developed your bishop and castled, your bishop here has a very nice diagonal, whereas if you go for e5, you're actually closing in your bishop's diagonal. And, in a future attempt to gain control in the center, for example, c3 and d4, that will continue locking in your bishop. Your bishop's not going to be able, I guess you're not going to be able to open up the center in a way that gives this bishop here a lot of mobility. And so already it's not looking great for this bishop. You might in the future need to move it to a different diagonal. But if you are going to occupy the dark squares in the center, this bishop here might become a very strong piece. So bishop to d3, having a very nice diagonal, could be an idea in the future. But what ends up happening is that white ends up trading off this light square bishop, but then still going for this idea where in the end the center is controlled by these dark squares. So you don't have a powerful bishop occupying the center on d3, and your only bishop is actually blocked by your pawn. So the setup between the pawns and bishop that white chose here is a little bit awkward. It would have been much better to have a light square bishop on d3 here, again, because of the dark square pawns that you have. So it's not a big deal, but it is something to look at. Here we have bishop to b4, and actually black's bishops are very nice here, threatening to trap the rook, and they're just controlling a lot of squares here. Their bishops have a lot of possibilities. So we already see a pretty major difference in bishops. So we have a3 and now b4 trying to close out this bishop and kind of lock away the bishop. And suddenly there's this very nice pressure point here on d4. Black is trying to attack it heavily. White must defend it heavily. If you lose this pawn becomes more weak as well. You're just going to be down material and you're going to lack a lot of central control. And so the whole game really revolves around this pawn on d4. So rook to e1, black castles, knight to d2, we have a5, and now knight to b3. This really interesting maneuver of the knight going to c5 in the future, which is a great square because in the case of takes, you might be able to combine and connect more pawns in the center, give you more control in the center, maybe open up the b file for your rook perhaps, and you might be able to have a very nice pawn structure if that happens. And so and of course, on top of that, you're also trading a knight for a bishop, taking away the two bishop advantage that black currently has. We have a trade bishop to a4, and even though there might not be some clear and direct ways to take advantage of this pin, why would you put yourself in a pin or allow yourself to be in a pin when you don't have to? So queen to d3, just a very safe move. We have queen to c4, and here you can simply move the knight here, target this pawn, maybe move the knight to c5, and again, go for this interesting structure where you get, some nice pawns in the center and perhaps a very active rook aimed at b7. So you could have gone for that, but instead we have immediately knight to c5 here. And of course, this is fine. It does defend the queen, but the issue is after takes, notice how passive these pieces are. All these pieces are simply defending this pawn. This pawn is isolated. It could become a future target. And black's pieces are putting a lot of pressure on white's position. This is actually looking quite bad for white here. Even though you're not down material, your position is not so good. Here we have g5, which is an interesting idea. Of course, you're threatening g4, which would remove a defender from the d4 square. And if white takes, then you're trading this outside pawn for the center pawn, and by doing so, this pawn becomes more weak, and of course this pawn stays weak. So it is an interesting trade that would have happened, and white did not want to go into this, so Rainn Wilson played g4 here, kicking the knight away, and once the knight moves, then taking. A very cool tactical idea because the knight was attacking this pawn, so you can afford to take the pawn if you manage to remove one of the defenders before you remove one of your defenders. So a really cool idea here. Now white is simply up a pawn. The knight comes to c5. Again, if takes, then you get a very nice position with your pawns. Your rook can come to target this b7 pawn. And this pawn is a massive weakness because it can never really push forward. This pawn here on c5 is completely stopping this pawn from having any sort of mobility. So it's actually a really cool central control, but also outside control that white has now here on the queen side. So it's a very nice position here for white. This is exactly what happened in the game. We have rook to e2, trying to get away from any sort of forks that could happen by the knight coming to c2 or d3. Even though maybe coming to d3 is not so dangerous, it still could have been a bit of an issue. We have rook to e2 and now knight to c2 anyways. And here a beautiful find, rook takes a4, followed by rook takes the knight on c2. You're simplifying the position, you're up a pawn, but of course also taking two minor pieces for a rook is actually good for the piece that has won the two minor pieces. There is a tricky move, rook a2 here, which Sardoche finds. It seems to be a bit dangerous. If this rook could apply more pressure, it could have ended badly. But of course, this rook just has no way to apply pressure fast. Of course, a move like this is just ridiculously slow, and it's just going to take so much time. White can very easily resolve this problem here by playing a ton of different options. For example, rook to d2 and then bishop to c3 or c1, probably c3 would have been one option. King to f1 and then rook to e2, and then this bishop can move because the rook's defended. Same thing with f3 and rook to f2. There's just many ways to get out of this, and all of which are faster than this idea to add more pressure. Here we have king to f1, and the king simply just marches in, which is another option. Bishop to c3 here, and it seems like white is white is forcing black to trade a piece of the a pair of the rooks, because of course you're threatening both of the rooks. There was maybe rook a3 to pin the bishop, so you're not actually forced to take the rook. But here Sardoche misses it. He trades the rook. This is completely winning. In fact, with the rook coming to c4, something you should recognize when a rook is kind of trapped like this in many directions like this, it only has one direction. You might be able to play a move like king b3 and often trap the rook. And even though you cannot take it, you have a knight here, so you can simply, take a couple of moves, and this rook just has no way to try to get into the game, and you could have won the rook this way, so that would have been a very cool idea. First, the knight comes back, and the issue with this, of course, the king is not here defending a4, so the rook simply goes to a4. And now we get to an endgame where white is, of course, winning, but you still have to have very good technique to do so. You have to realize on which side of the board you want to play, and clearly you have all of your pieces and a potential passed pawn on the queen side. So messing around with f4 and h4 are not moves that you want to do, because if anything, it gives black a chance to go into the game. You should try to go knight to b3, knight to a5, pick up this pawn, promote a queen, and win the game. But by playing f4 and then h4, you're actually giving this king a way in by h5. If you take, the king is going to sweep up these pawns, and maybe black might even have a chance to try to create some sort of play on the king side. And if you push, that might even be worse, because now the king can go here, pick up these pawns, and this pawn is a very clear problem for white. And so by playing on the king side when it's very clear that you should be playing on the queen side, where you have all of your pieces and your potential passed pawn, you're messing around a little bit, and, even though white is still winning here, it's giving black some chances that you should not be giving black at all. Here we do have h5, a very, very sharp move here by black, very good move. And now knight to b1, forgetting about the g4 pawn, rook to a2 check, and then rook to h2, also forgetting about the pawn. White finally takes, bishop to e1, defending the pawn, and it almost seems as though now suddenly white is kind of gone in the defensive. The bishop needs to defend the pawn, the king needs to defend the bishop, and suddenly it seems much harder to get any pieces out to take this pawn and then to promote this queen. And this is exactly what Sardoche should be doing here as black, trying to create any sort of counterplay that he can. And Rainn Wilson really failed to act quickly on his advantage and to quickly realize that he needs to take this pawn as fast as possible and promote a queen. And so this endgame, it was a bit tricky, but in the end, it did end up going nicely for white here. We have knight to e2 coming with the knight. And now simply Sardoche loses the rook. Just a very weird blunder here to make us black. You could simply take the rook with the pawn, the pawn with the rook. And even though white is probably still better here, it is becoming a lot more close to even as it should be, a lot closer to a draw. But taking here, by the way, quickly, taking the bishop and getting two minor pieces for the rook is not possible because of h5, h6, h7, and queen. So it would not work here. So you really do have to take with the rook the pawn, but by taking with the king, you drop the rook, and now this is a very easy game. You do still need to be a bit careful not to lose these two pawns, because doing a checkmate with a knight and bishop is a very hard task. And so you need to be careful, but when you're up material, it's very easy to take up the pawns of your opponent and to promote your own pawns. So very nice technique here by white, making a queen and delivering mate. Let's move on to game number 2. So in game 2, Sardoche has the white pieces, and he begins with d4, and we have a London system, and black chooses d6. Often against the London, you see this setup of d5, and eventually black tries to go and play c5. But by playing d6, you are basically saying that your main goal will be to not give this e5 square away so easily, which typically black does do against the London, and instead actually fight for potentially playing e5 at some point. This does come with some clear downsides, being the fact that this bishop won't be able to develop as fast. Additionally, if you want to eventually push e5, you probably are going to play knight to c6, and therefore your pawn won't be able to go to c5 and target the center. So it's a strange setup, but it does have a goal of eventually going for e5. We have c4 here, and kind of what I was saying is that white is going to get a very strong center. You're not going to be able to develop your pieces nicely in a way that will allow you to still maintain a nice center as black. And so you might have to just put your bishops on these fianchetto squares, which is still perfectly fine, but it does come with the drawback of giving white a very nice center with pawns. In fact, here we see e4, d4, and c4 on the board for Sardoche. Bishop to d3, queen to d2, getting the queen out, and also trying to line it up with the bishop. So if black castles here, maybe there's an idea of bishop h6, taking away a key defender of the king, and, let's say takes, the queen is suddenly infiltrated. There's ideas of already checkmate, potentially h4, h5. If takes, then the rook can get in, and all sorts of ideas are now, in the air because of that. Which is why here typically you would not take, you would wait until white takes, because if white takes, then the king is guarding h6, so it's harder for the queen to infiltrate. But overall, this is a pretty cool strategical plan for white to do here. We have queen to d7, a3, both players kind of being flexible with how they're going to castle, and finally black castles queenside. We have b4 now, and you can see a very aggressive position for these pawns on b4 all the way to e4, and by doing so you haven't really given your king enough time to castle, and so it is very strange to open up the position so greatly like you're doing here by pushing all these pawns forward when your king is still in the center. And so at some point castling might be important just to get your king safe, and then continuing with whatever you were going to do here, pushing these pawns, pressuring this king here. But it's important to not forget about castling. And even though all these pawns might be safe for right now, they might all be protected, there's easily, possibilities of pushing these pawns, opening up the center, and this king might, kind of get hit because of that. We have b5 and now e5. You can see Sardoche is playing completely on the aggressive side, playing as aggressive as can be. He takes here, and rook to d1 again, not castling, not wasting a move on castling, instead immediately going for this king. And this king has been opened up by the pawn pushes that white has done, and so maybe there are chances to attack along the c file, but I still would recommend to not lose sight of the fact that your king is right here in the center of the board. And if you open up the position, that could help you attack, but it could also help your opponent. So, make sure you're careful when it comes to castling as well. And here, finally, white castles. By doing so, white does lose a pawn, but the position is still completely decent for white. There's still a lot of attacking possibilities due to how weak this king is. For example, rook to c1, you can hopefully eventually get another piece on the c file. You can attack along here, maybe rook to a1 in some cases. For example, if pawn takes, I think rook a1 is a very strong choice here potentially, just to go for this pawn and come from the other side of the king, I guess. And so there's definitely chances to attack here. We see a check here, we see takes, and now rook to c6, trying to attack some of these pawns here next to the king. There could be cases where sacrificing this is possible, but for right now, that's probably not the idea. Knight to c4, which is an interesting move because it kind of cuts out the rook from ever coming back. And even though that might not seem like a problem, because of course, black does not have a bishop that can ever really try to attack this rook, and of course, trading the rook for a queen or for a rook is completely fine for white. It still means that this rook might be out of the game. Even though it might not be eaten, it might not be captured, it still is out of the game. So, maybe this is why rook to c1 was played, with the idea of, in the future, sacrificing one of the rooks to allow both of the rooks to kind of come back into the game. Or rather to allow, I guess, the queen and a rook to come into the game and attack together. So that's exactly what we end up seeing here. Instead of taking the rook, however, black takes this rook, and by doing so allows white to take back with the rook. I guess you could also take with the pawn and attack the queen, but here clearly white is just up a piece. Notice white took a knight, hoping to actually sack the knight for the rook and then get another piece into the attack. But instead of taking, black took the other rook, which means that you can take here, and you're just up a piece. Very easy to close the game from here. Of course, winning an extra pawn here. The king moves to b7, doing this trade, which of course is just a very nice way to simplify the position when you're up material. A fork here. At this point, it's completely game over. Sardoche is easily going to win this, and we have checkmate on the board. Let's move on to game number 3, because indeed we did see Sardoche winning the second game and losing the first one, so we have a tiebreaker in Pogchamps 3 finals. Let's see what happens. So in game 3, it is a shorter game, a blitz game, and Rainn Wilson has the white pieces. We have e4, c5, and we have the exact same opening as game 1. Here d5, and here white takes. Last game, or the first game rather, white pushed e5 in this exact position, which ended up being a blunder because this bishop then, doesn't have any future ideas to attack. And so I really like what Rainn Wilson did here, learning from his previous mistakes and realizing that next time he will take the pawn, keep the position open, and hopefully by doing so give this bishop a better future. So he castles quickly. We have bishop to e7, black also castles, and now bishop to b5, bishop to d7, both players developing, putting their rooks on central files, and getting all their pieces out into the game. a6 here, and you can bring the bishop back, of course not to here, it will get trapped, but you could easily bring it back to f1, e2, or you can take, which might be the simplest option because on f1 you're completely undeveloping it, on e2 you're blocking your control over the file, so all of these moves have some sort of downside, so it might just be simplest to take, and then maybe push d4 and go for striking in the center. We have b5 now, knight to e2, trying to get the knight to the other side of the board, and now knight to f4, going to the king's side, trying to attack. And I think in blitz, it's much easier to attack successfully because your opponent just won't have the time to react with the moves that are necessary, and therefore a lot of the attacking possibilities that wouldn't work in a 10-minute game would work in a 5-minute blitz game. And so I think that attacking is a very important thing in these types of games. And actually already here, queen to d2 is a slight inaccuracy because of knight to e5, knight to e4, hitting the queen, and the queen has a very important role of defending the knight. And if you can give an important role to a queen, but you can give it to another piece, give it to the other piece, because a queen is a horrible is a horrible piece when it comes to doing a roll, because it's so easy to kick it out. So for example, knight to e4, if this was a pawn defending the knight, then you don't care because a knight is worth more. But because it's a queen, you have to move it. And for example, queen to e3, there's even just queen c7. And I mean, black is completely dominating here. They have control of the file. Their knight is powerful. They have control over here. And this is not looking great for white here. And so typically speaking, if you have to defend from the knight, maybe move the knight. Maybe try to defend the knight with a bishop, even though this looks very, very nasty because, of course, you're blocking in your rooks from connecting. You're undeveloping your bishop. And so maybe here moving the knight would have been the strongest choice. But regardless, we have this position, queen to c7, knight to e5, and now knight to e4 comes. Queen to e3, trying to still maintain control of the knight. But after f6, of course, the problem is the bishop and queen are just attacking the knight. Whenever the knight moves, you're going to lose this knight. And even though this might seem to save everything, notice you can take here with an attack on the queen. And so then after the queen moves, then you can take here, and you're actually not going to be that much better here. So you know, knight to e5 is a nice attempt, but if you were to first take here and then take the knight here, then it wouldn't work out so well. However, in this game, black took the knight first, so that's a pretty big mistake. In fact, white is already in a very strong position already. After queen to c7, however, knight takes d5, and white is just completely winning here. The knight is in a very powerful spot, hitting the queen. Also, the knight here is, of course, now undefended because the pawn was defending it. And so this is just looking very bad. We have bishop to h2 check, which is kind of like, you know, a Hail Mary. You know, you're going to lose the knight. You might as well try this because it is tricky. If you go king to f1, there is checkmate, and you're losing the queen, but the important thing is checkmate. And so you have to go king to h1, in which case white is completely winning. But in the game, we have king to f1, and Rainn Wilson actually loses after checkmate, knight to d2. It's a really beautiful checkmate. Just right here in the center of the board, every piece doing its part, the rook controlling here, the bishop this, and all you need is a simple check by the knight. And that is the end of Pogchamps 3. I think that it's a really silly ending because it's not like one person was completely winning this whole game, but rather it came down to this kind of, you have two options, one of them you're completely winning, the other one you lose by checkmate, and unfortunately Rainn Wilson lost by checkmate in this game. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. Make sure you subscribe for more content like this, and I'll see you guys next time. Peace out.